The movie starts with a woman named Jo and her daughter Alice driving through a snowy landscape in northern Sweden. Jo has a radio playing, but only bits of someone's voice can be heard. Alice asks about her father, and when they reach their house, Alice watches a video on her iPad of her mother telling a story from the International Space Station. Jo places a mysterious glowing package in a shell and then notices a snowy figure in the woods. Alice, now asleep, hears her mother calling for her. 5 weeks earlier in Germany, Alice wakes up and calls her mother on the ISS. Paul, an ISS crew member, works on the CAL experiment while on a call with Henry Caldera from the Rocket Propulsion Laboratory in California. The experiment works, but something hits the ISS, causing an explosion and fire. Jo and the crew rush to an evacuation capsule, but Jo and another member return to help Paul, who was trapped by the machine. Henry, the chief scientific consultant at the RPL, connects with mission control officers Irina and Michaela from NASA and Friedrich from the European Space Agency. Meanwhile, Alice and her father Magnus head to school, and Jo was instructed to go on a spacewalk to fix the evacuation capsule's power cables, and she and her co-worker Ilya don their suits and go outside. Henry argues against the evacuation, prioritizing the experiment's importance, and Jo finds the cables irreparable, and Paul goes into cardiac arrest. Jo is then told to fix the secondary life support system, and she finds a body tangled in the wires, but it floats away before she can catch it, and Paul dies inside the ISS. With only 3 people able to leave in the Soyuz 2 capsule, one must stay behind to fix Soyuz 1 and leave later. Jo decides to stay, and on Earth, Alice and Magnus learn about Jo's situation. Magnus tells Alice that her friend Wendy's father Paul has died, and Jo sends her crew off in Soyuz 2 and begins fixing Soyuz 1 with 19 hours of oxygen left. The ISS was only powered by solar energy, meaning Jo will have alternating 45-minute periods of power and darkness. With only a minute and a half of solar power left, Jo leaves the capsule to get Alice's necklace and returns just in time. She sits in the capsule with Paul's body and draws a picture of the Russian body that she saw, and suddenly her 45-minute timer speeds up and daylight returns. She begins searching for her new batteries. Henry insists Jo retrieve the CAL experiment data, emphasizing its importance. Alice and Magnus arrive in Kazakhstan near a mission control center, hoping to speak to Jo while she still has power. The Soyuz 2 lands safely with the astronauts, and Jo is informed to retrieve the CAL experiment if she has time. In Kazakhstan, Alice tells Magnus she knows he and Jo had problems, but still wants them to be friends. They reach the mission control center but lose connection with Jo, and Jo returns to the capsule to fix the batteries and hears noises. She ventures out wearing an oxygen mask and finds herself in a house corridor with Alice's necklace on a doorknob, and suddenly she's back at the ISS as power returns. A scream from Alice brings us back to the first scene, and Jo trudges through the snowy woods to a house similar to the one she left Alice in. She finds Alice's necklace on a cupboard and hears knocking. She opens it to find Alice, who asks where she's been all this time. The scene continues in snowy Sweden. Jo carries a freezing Alice back to the house and warms her up and puts her in a hot bath. Jo sees another Alice still asleep in bed, and when Jo goes to boil more water, she finds the bathtub empty. She asks the other Alice where her daughter is, and in the past, Jo tries to connect with Houston but fails. She has only 6 hours of life support left. In Kazakhstan, Henry and Irene discuss the situation, and Irene tells Henry that there's no sign of life on the ISS, but Jo is still there and has managed to switch 2 batteries. Magnus talks to Friedrich from the ESA, who says Jo's chances of returning are slim since she has to calculate her own re-entry. Jo works on the batteries and records a message for her family when she hears a voice telling her to stop breathing. She thinks it's Paul and finds his amputated arm in the Destiny module. She holds the hands and sees Paul for a moment, and Jo receives a pre-recorded message from Mission Control saying that they haven't been able to reach her. Henry and Irene talk to the Mission Control Center, and Henry receives a call from the Skagerrak, which means something to Irene. They ask each other about their siblings, and Henry's twin brother Bud, a retired astronaut, is interviewed online about Jo's situation. He gets annoyed when asked about bringing back dead bodies, and Jo works through the dark periods using a portable oxygen mask and manages to fix all the batteries. Soyuz 1 was powered up and Joe starts the launch process, and she retrieves the Cal data core and gets into the capsule. She records an emotional message for Magnus and Alice, then locks up the capsule. A bolt malfunctions, delaying the launch, and at the mission control center, the countdown reaches 0, and everyone seems to lose hope. Irene leads a prayer for the departed, and something moves inside the ISS, and Joe's bolt issue is suddenly resolved. Her capsule takes off and she sees a shadow inside the ISS. Henry and Irene toast Joe and Paul, but then realize Soyuz 1 has entered the atmosphere. They search for Joe and the capsule lands in the desert, and Joe wakes up, opening the door, and cars and helicopters arrive, and Joe is reunited with Alice and Magnus. Henry examines the Cal data core and seems shocked by the findings. Joe, Alice, and Magnus were on a plane, and Alice holds Joe's hand but suddenly finds herself alone. Joe experiences the same thing, but only for a few seconds, before returning to normal. In Sweden, Joe asks Alice where the other version of her is, and they head out in search of her with the Cal data core in Joe's backpack. The next scene starts with Joe and Alice walking toward another cabin in the snow. Suddenly, Alice loses Joe in the fog of the snowstorm, and back in the past, Joe is admitted to the hospital, and Alice is worried because Joe doesn't look like herself. Later, Joe attends a press conference and she says she's happy to be back home, and afterward all the astronauts sit with Wendy and her mother Frida, and Joe accidentally calls Frida by the wrong name, Erica. At the Star City labs in Russia, Henry shows his colleague data from the Cal. He says he got the same results as Paul when he first ran the experiment, but now the results are different. His colleague finds this hard to believe, and meanwhile, Bud Caldera was on a ship for a space convention. He sets up a table and signs pictures for fans, but he doesn't seem happy about it. A meeting is held with all the astronauts and space agency professionals in Russia. They discuss the accident on the ISS, and Joe describes the body she believes caused the collision, but the others think she imagined it due to her lack of oxygen. Later, Joe practices walking on a treadmill and takes daily pills. At the Russian accommodation for the European Space Agency, Joe and Magnus have dinner, but things are pretty tense. Joe worries that Alice has forgotten Swedish, and on the ship, Bud participates in a debate. The host accuses Bud of lying in his book about his mission to the moon, saying it's full of inaccuracies. Henry finally gets the same result on his computer, 2 pulsing circles. But his phone camera can't capture it, so he draws a replica instead. Alice helps Joe walk, but Joe loses her balance and falls, and when Alice goes to get Magnus, Joe notices that she's in the same hallway with the wooden cupboard at the end. Henry and Aaron argue about the data again, and while they argue, Henry watches Alice and Wendy play hide and seek. Alice sees Wendy throw her stuffed rabbit into a puddle and then stomp on it. She yells at Wendy, who denies doing anything. They fight, and later, Alice realizes her rabbit was clean and dry. Joe continues to insist she saw a USSR astronaut's body, but the others say all USSR astronauts are accounted for. They believe space debris caused the collision, and Joe returns to her room at the ESA accommodation feeling upset. She tells Magnus she loves him and kisses him, and Henry meets Alice, who is sitting on a swing. She asks about his work, and he talks about quantum physics, describing how the same object can be in 2 places at once. Joe asks Magnus if she seems different, and he says that she does. And he drops Alice off and thanks Joe for retrieving the Cal data, and he warns her to be careful around the bureaucrats. Later, Joe walks with her crew members, who also find it hard to believe what she saw. They visit Paul's grave and lay flowers, and Joe has a vision of Paul reciting a poem to her, and at the meeting, Joe withdraws her statement about the spacesuit. The meeting ends and the astronauts can go home, and Joe was happy to be home, but things seem off. She remembers having a red car, but now it's blue. Irina visits Henry's house and they drink wine. Irina reveals that she has stage 4 lymphoma and is dying, and they slow dance to music, and on the ship, Bud confronts the debate host, who continues to poke holes in Bud's story. Bud asks for help, saying he doesn't know how his colleagues died on the Apollo mission, and he blames Henry, but the host doesn't know who that is. When the host taunts Bud, Bud throws him off the ship. Back in the hotel room, Henry sees Irina as a corpse and yells in shock, and in the present, Alice tells Joe that she doesn't think the other cabin was real, and Joe tells Alice that she isn't her daughter, and Alice asks where her real mother is. The next scene starts with Alice and Magnus walking through the snowy woods in Sweden. They reach a house and Magnus assures Alice that they won't see her again, and in the present, Joe receives a surprise belated Christmas and birthday celebration from Magnus and Alice. After dinner, Magnus tells Joe that they should talk about how things were before she left. He says she didn't look him in the eye when she left, but Joe doesn't remember it that way. At night, Joe brings up the issue with Magnus again. He admits he was suspicious about Joe having an affair with Friedrich, and Magnus also admits that he met someone and that they shared a kiss. Henry makes note in his office, and Bud wakes up on the ship and there was a commotion due to the debate host's death. Elsewhere, Michaela calls Henry and tells him that they are shutting down the Cal project because it doesn't seem to have worked. In a therapy session, Joe tells her therapist that she's misremembering things, and she says that there's a piano in the house, but she doesn't play. The therapist diagnoses her with PTSD and suggests lithium might help. Joe says this could end her career, and after her session, Henry approaches Joe to talk about her research. He shows her the Cal and talks about the effects of space travel, describing the hallucinations pilots and astronauts have faced. As the Cal runs in the background, Joe feels a sudden pain in her left eye, and she looks at the Cal reactor. On the ship, Bud calls his daughter Connie, saying things aren't working well. He wants to contact someone, but Connie dismisses him and tells him to take his pills. At home, Joe finds Alice hiding in a cupboard with her necklace on the door handle, and Alice admits that she thought Joe's return would be different. Henry talks to Professor Louis about the Cal, and he says the machine picked up a state where one particle was in two states at the same time, suggesting a pathway to a different universe. Louis doesn't believe him, and Henry wonders if the experiment was affecting his brain chemistry. Meanwhile, Agent Bright from the FBI talks to Bud about the missing debate host, and Bud makes excuses to seem innocent. Joe compares the lithium tablets with the vitamin tablets that she was given when she returned to Earth, and she goes to the ESA, where a machine confirms they're both lithium. Joe searches the database and finds that astronauts with hallucinations were given these tablets, including Henry Caldera. Two men enter the office and start packing up things, but they can't see her. The light looks different from their perspective, and suddenly they disappear, and Joe goes to Henry's office and finds him talking to his reflection, which looks like Bud. He makes a comment about curiosity and leaves Joe, and later, Friedrich approaches Joe in her office and talks about how they plan to be together and leave to work privately. This shocks Joe, who can't recall anything, and while giving a talk to Alice's class, Joe suddenly asks Magnus if Sarah was the woman he met with. She does this in front of everyone, and Joe storms out and drives the family home, but nearly causes an accident. She holds her left eye, which hurts her, and back home, Friedrich tells Magnus that Joe needs rehab for astronaut burnout. He admits he and Joe had an affair, and Joe enters and tells Magnus that she had no memory of the affair. She sends Friedrich out, but Magnus thinks that she's lying, and Joe then finds a package from the Marine Observatory in Denmark with 2 tapes. They say that they heard her on the ISS, and Agent Bright looks at the CCTV footage on the ship and sees Bud walking with the debate host. The video was covered by 2 pulsing circles, similar to Henry's Cal results. Joe listens to the tapes and hears her own voice, trying to connect with the station. The second tape was from 1967 and records an accident in space where a woman's voice was heard. Alice wakes up and goes downstairs to see a room full of people dressed in black. It seems to be Joe's funeral, and she sees another Alice in the room, also dressed in black. She screams and the vision fades, and Magnus tucks her inside a cupboard to make her feel safe. He says she's scared of Joe, and Joe and Magnus argue, and Magnus goes to call Friedrich to send Joe to rehab. Joe tries to take the phone and pushes Magnus, who hits his head on a table as he falls, and the final scene shows the painting from the cabin in Sweden depicting a skeletal creature. The episode starts right where the last one ended. Panicking, Joe calls an ambulance and then quickly drives away with Alice, telling her that they're just going for a drive. They stop at Joe's office, where she listens to a recording of her phone call with Alice from the International Space Station. She then takes Cal Core and puts it in the car, and meanwhile Henry hears a knock on his hotel room door, but when he opens it, no one was there. In the mirror, Bud watches him, and later Irina calls Henry and talks about a part of the quantum theory, and she explains that what happens to one particle affects its counterpart even if they're far apart. Suddenly, Henry's vision starts to tilt, and Joe, driving on a ferry, calls her astronaut colleague, Ilya, and she tells him about the lithium pills and asks him to check on his. At the European Space Agency, Henry was furious to find the Cal missing and calls Irina for help. While eating at a restaurant, Joe asks Alice why she hides in cupboards. Alice says she's scared of something called the Valia, a person or dream that makes her hide. Joe agrees to draw what scares her if Alice does the same. Joe calls the person who sent her the tapes, saying that she's on the way. But the man says his sister sent tapes and claims she's crazy, and Joe looks up Skagerrak online and finds out that the siblings were prosecuted for blackmailing astronauts with fake tape recordings. Joe calls Magnus, who was with Friedrich, and she was about to tell them that she was wrong when Alice shows her a drawing, the Valia as an astronaut in an orange suit. Joe questions Friedrich about the medication, but his answers weren't satisfying. She tells Magnus that they'll be back soon and hangs up. And Joe and Alice arrive at the Skigagar Observatory. A woman comes out to meet them and takes them inside, and she says her brother heard Joe on ghost tapes left by their father, who recorded sounds from space. And the woman takes Joe and Alice out on a boat and talks about a USSR mission where astronauts saw angels. She plays a tape and asks Joe to hear a woman asking for help, and this was from when Irina went to space. The woman then says that they heard Paul Lancaster on the day of the incident and were surprised Joe came back instead. Alice gets scared when the woman plays the static sound, so they return to land. The woman gives Joe the tapes before they can get in their car, and Alice secretly calls Magnus and tells him that they're going to the family cabin. And Alice helps Joe think things through, and Alice describes the Valia as a dead astronaut floating around the Earth, murmuring something. They play the old tape again and hear the words clearly, and the woman's voice, which Alice says is the same as the Valia's, says the world is the wrong way around, and Henry tries to talk to Bud through a mirror, but Bud threatens him. Joe and Alice get closer to their cabin and find two roads, and Joe decides to drive across a frozen lake, and they finally reach the cabin. Joe hears a voice that sounds like Alice's from the house, but dismisses it, and settled in the cabin, Joe listens to the phone call between her and Alice on the tape. Alice says that that wasn't her voice and that she doesn't speak Swedish or call Joe Mama. Elsewhere, another Alice, wrapped in furs, trudges through the snow and calls out for Joe, calling her Mama. The next scene shows us the ISS where Paul was working on the Cal, and Joe was on the phone with Alice. Paul plugs in the Cal, causing a commotion, and Joe slums into the glass and gets badly injured. We see Paul trying to help her, and on Earth, Magnus and Alice receive bad news at school. On the ISS, Paul couldn't find the Cal, and the other crew members leave, and Paul tells them to inform Henry that he lost the Cal, but they don't remember. Later, while laying beside Joe's dead body, Paul thinks he's seeing her breathing. On Earth, Magnus finds Alice hiding in a cupboard, and she taps her foot and sees a vision of Joe coming toward her with a flashlight, but it then fades. In space, Paul hears a strange noise that starts to sound like Joe's voice. When he reconnects with Houston, he suggests leaving Joe's body behind due to her injuries, and he moves her body to another part of the ISS where she suddenly grabs his hand and he sees a real alive Joe. Alice plays with Wendy, who hears her father was coming home, and Magnus arrives and tells Alice that they're leaving Joe up there. Paul faces a malfunction on his Soyuz, which mysteriously fixes itself. He sees a silhouette inside the ISS, and he's welcomed back with fanfare, but calls his wife Frida instead of Erica, and Magnus tries to console Alice about Joe being left in space, but she doesn't respond. During a meeting with space personnel, nobody except Paul remembers the Cal, and Houston refuses responsibility for leaving Joe up there. Magnus's therapist suggests a ceremony for Alice to process Joe's death, and Paul watches Apollo 18 mission videos and hears static similar to the ISS sound. He searches for Henry Caldera, but only finds Bud Caldera. Michaela tells him Apollo 18 was a failure, and she doesn't know where Bud is. And at Joe's funeral, Alice hides in a cupboard. Paul arrives and vents about leaving Joe in space, and at the funeral, he scolds Wendy for not talking to Alice. Wendy angrily tells Alice that her father thinks Joe might still be alive, and Alice sees another Alice in her pajamas and Joe screaming for her mother. Magnus pulls Alice away and suggests they go somewhere alone. Alice insists on going to her mother's cabin, and on the way they get snowed in, and Alice insists on walking. In California, Paul arrives near Bud Caldera's house, and Magnus and Alice settle inside the cabin. Magnus breaks down about Joe's death and tells Alice that they need to start over, and Paul confronts Bud and sees clips of the Apollo 18 accident. In Paul's vision, everyone returned safely, and in Bud's, 2 men died. They argue, and Bud pulls out a gun, and in the cabin, Alice wakes up to see a car arrive. Joe gets out and Alice watches her from the window. The next scene starts with Alice seeing Joe step out of the car right outside the cabin, but when Alice goes outside, Joe wasn't there. She calls out in the parallel universe and Joe hears something, and Alice puts on her coat and runs into the snow. In another universe, Joe and Alice listened to the recording of their phone call right before the accident, and they were speaking in Swedish, but Alice says she doesn't speak Swedish, and Joe says she doesn't remember the Cal before the accident. Meanwhile, Henry, Friedrich, and Magnus were on their way to Joe's cabin. Henry claims he's been through the same thing. While putting the Cal in the shed, Joe hears the other Alice screaming again. With one Alice still in bed, Joe goes out to look for the other, and Alice reaches the cabin again, but it seems broken down and empty. She finds a cupboard and gets inside and hangs her necklace on the door. The door slams shut, locking her in, and Joe finds her there, but she is already suffering from the cold. Joe carries Alice back to the original cabin and warms her in a bath, and when Joe leaves to get more hot water, she gets a headache and disappears, along with the water in the bathtub. Alice was alone once again. Her father finds her and warms her up, but doesn't believe she saw Joe. In the other universe, Joe tells Alice to get dressed, and they go out to find the other Alice. On the way, Alice suggests Joe was seeing things, and Joe admits Alice was right, and she was not her mother. This makes Alice upset, and she runs away. The other Alice bundles up in warm clothes and goes out again. This time, Magnus wakes up when she leaves, and this Alice finds the necklace beads her counterpart left in the snow while walking with Joe. She eventually finds the Cal fallen in the snow. Alice, who ran away from Joe, finds the empty, broken down cabin, but this time the whack cassette player they used was on the table. She goes upstairs and finds the necklace on the cupboard door, and she gets inside, but the other Alice arrives at the front door. In the cupboard, the first Alice records a message on the cassette player, and the other Alice finds the message and records one back. The two Alices start talking to each other even though they can't seem to see each other. They talk about being at the cabin, and suddenly Joe and Paul hear the girls' voices in their respective universes. They go upstairs and see the voices coming from the cassette player, and Joe takes the player and gets in her car. Magnus sees Alice's footsteps leading out of the frozen lake, and in the cabin Joe left, a lamp falls over and starts a fire. The two Alices look in the mirror and talk to each other, and one tells the other that her mother's dead. As they talk about her death, Joe realizes the cabin was on fire and rushes back, and both Alices realize that their mothers have been swapped. Elsewhere, while a road was being cleared of snow, Henry tells Magnus about his own experience, how his crew members were dead until suddenly they were alive again. As Magnus and the police search the woods, Henry goes on his own and gets a headache. Joe runs into the burning cabin, but it turns into an empty, broken one instead, and she can still see the flames and the reflection of a painting, and she goes upstairs and finds Alice in the cupboard. The other Alice speaks through the cassette player. Joe speaks to her own Alice through the cassette player, and Henry follows a light in the snow and finds the Cal. Then he sees the burning cabin and drops the Cal in the snow as he rushes toward it. The cabin shifts to the one on fire, and Joe pulls Alice out, although she's inhaled a lot of fumes. While Henry approaches the cabin, Bud confronts Paul in another universe. Joe gives Alice to Henry and goes back in to look for her real daughter, and when Bud shoots Paul, something happens and Henry and Bud switch places, or rather switch back. Henry was in the apartment with the bleeding Paul, and Bud was now in the snow with Alice, and he leaves her in the snow and walks away. Joe finds Alice unconscious, and while she was doing CPR, Joe's real mother arrives and says she can't feel the other Alice anymore. Joe tells her to go to her father, and for a second, Magnus sees silhouettes of 3 of them in the snow from afar. It then fades and he reunites with Alice, and Joe revives the other Alice, but by then, her own Alice was gone. Sometime later, the injured Alice was in the hospital, and she dreams of seeing the Valia, the corpse in the astronaut suit. The Valia tells Alice that she can take her from her mother, and when she wakes up, Magnus tells Alice that Irina was helping Joe get better, and Alice says that they need to get Joe back. The final episode starts with a scene of Joe in the ISS, with her voiceover telling Alice that she'll always be with her. Then we see Joe being taken to a facility where Irene was in charge. And meanwhile, Bud listens to a tape of himself saying he thought his co-astronauts were dead, but now they're alive. He gets angry and breaks the cowl with an axe, and Magnus and Alice come home, and Alice tries to explain everything to Magnus, but he doesn't believe her. While Joe was unconscious, the women at the facility do an ultrasound, and one of them tells Irina that the image is corrupted. Henry's taken to the police for shooting Paul, and he insists he is different from Bud, but the police don't believe him. In the first universe, Bud tells Friedrich that Joe destroyed the cowl, and Friedrich was surprised that Bud isn't more worried about it. Joe wakes up and finds herself locked in her room, and a woman opens the door but leaves without saying anything. Later, Joe tries to explain about her real daughter to Irina, and Irina then tells Joe that she's 4 weeks pregnant. When Joe grabs Irina's hand, she suddenly sees the dead cosmonaut instead. Joe realizes that it's her and mentions a capsule on fire, which scares Irina, making her rush away. Irina calls Henry, not knowing he is now Bud, and Henry takes a polygraph test and tells the truth, and Joe gets an unexpected visit from Isla. She was happy but soon realizes he doesn't believe her either, and he was taking over for Irina. When he doesn't believe her, Joe tells him to leave, but he secretly gives her a pair of keys as he leaves. Meanwhile, the Magnuses in both worlds talk to a therapist about what they've been going through, and Bud meets Irina at a restaurant. He reveals his own identity and mentions how her counterpart died in space. Irina says they both went through an accident, but Bud accuses her of being in denial. Joe uses the keys to get out of her room, and she checks on another patient in the facility and sees 2 identical old men staring back at each other. Shocked, she rushes back to her room and gets into bed. Back home, Alice talks with Wendy, who admits she thinks her father is still alive. In the other universe, the 2 girls talk about Paul being in the hospital, and later, Alice tells Magnus that Joe's stories are all made up. He agrees to let her see Joe, and he gives her a box of things found at the cabin, which includes the cassette player. In the other universe, Paul packs up the house, and as he and Alice prepare to move out, this Alice also texts the cassette player. She talks to the other Alice and asks to speak with her mother, and the other Alice couldn't respond, so Alice leaves the house with Magnus, and as they walk away, Alice tells her father that she's going to let the other Alice keep her mother. At the police station, Henry's polygraph test was positive, but while Henry expects his DNA to be different from Bud's, it turns out to be exactly the same. He is then charged with the murder of Ian Rogers and the attempted murder of Paul. In the other universe, Bud watches Ian conduct a Jack the Ripper tour, and after it ends, Bud gives him flowers and tells him to live his best life and leaves. At the facility, Irina visits Joe, and Joe asks her if going into space is what causes there to be 2 of her and 2 of Irina. But Irina tells her to let these thoughts go as they can be undone, and later, Alice is allowed to be Joe. She tells Joe that the other Alice feels okay about Joe being there with her, and they agree that Alice needs a mom and Joe needs an Alice, and they can be that for each other. Joe then talks with Magnus and says he's going to start taking the pills, and they then think about whether they should have a new baby. Irina looks at the ultrasound and sees something odd, and she writes an email about how space travel makes people go mad and asks people to report their own strange experiences to her. And meanwhile, Paul wakes up in the hospital. As Magnus and Alice prepare to go home, Joe tells Magnus that she may not seem like his Joe, but she still loves him. As they talk, Irina sits by Alice and introduces herself, and she says her friends call her Valia. Alice asks Joe if she's from there, and if Magnus is from here, then where will the baby be from? We hear a clip of Joe's phone call to Alice from the ISS, and at the same time, we see the other Joe's body floating in the ISS. She suddenly grabs the floating iPad and looks into the camera at the end of the season's episode, and that is where the season leaves us. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.